Shabbat Shalom. Open back up in your Siddurim because we need a visual aid. Page 178. Andrea just read this for us very beautifully, but we're going to take a look at the prayer for Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel. Now, we're not going to be examining every single passage of it. It is a beautiful composition that was written in 1948 to mark the independence of the new state and to give us a blessing that could be shared in communities around the world and around Israel in honor of its creation and in hope for its continued existence, which, remember, in 1948 was certainly not a foregone conclusion. It was in desperate times. But one phrase in particular from this prayer has generated a lot of controversy, and that's why we have brackets on the page. So take a look at the page, either in the English or in the Hebrew, and you'll notice in the second line of either that there is a phrase, Reshit Smichat Geulatenu, the beginning of our redemption. Unfortunately, the English translation loses much of the poetry. It is the beginning of the blossoming of our redemption is the literal translation, and one that is much more in keeping with Hebrew poetry. Reshit Smichat Geulatenu. This is the phrase that was penned by the early rabbis of the time in order to reflect the emotion of what the state of Israel meant to them religiously, not just as a secular state, not just as a one among many nations of the world, but that this was maybe tentatively peeking out, the little bud pushing up through the ground, breaking forth out of the darkness, especially of the Shoah that had just passed, that maybe we were catching a glimpse of the opening of redemption. This was the phrase. And that's very controversial. Why is it controversial? We've blossomed. Well, but it's not controversial because we've blossomed. It's controversial because we've blossomed without Mashiach. Where's the Messiah? Where are the prophecies fulfilled the way that people thought they were going to be fulfilled? Because, we all had our vision of what this was going to look like. And there were many, remember, in 1948 from both the Orthodox and Reform movement who were opposed to the establishment of an independent secular state of Israel at all. The conservative movement in the 1940s was the only movement that was in favor of Zionism as we know it. The others opposed it. The Reform movement opposed it back then. They're much better now, don't worry. But back then they opposed it because it was an expression of Jewish exceptionalism, and it would alienate the other nations of the world from the Jews who were living within their borders. Because we had made a pinky promise back in the 1800s, said the Reform movement, that we were no longer interested in returning to Israel, that we were good citizens of the countries that we lived in now and had no aspirations whatsoever. This was one of the ideas that, of course, split many people away from the Reform movement of the 1800s. Again, the Reform movement has changed their platform since then, so please don't go accost a modern Reform movement person expecting them to justify the 1848 ideas. But was it then Reshit Smichat Geulatenu? Could we say that this is indeed the beginning of the redemption, capital T, capital R? Well, there were some that wanted to hedge their bets. And as you can see in brackets, we have a very small word, tehei in the Hebrew, and that in English, which changes the meaning of the phrase. So without the bracketed words, it means, please bless the land of Israel, the state of Israel, because it is the beginning of the blossoming of our redemption. With the words in brackets, it means, please bless the state of Israel, so it may become the beginning of the blossoming of our redemption. Do we see the difference here, right? Words matter. Words matter because they are meant to reflect and convey our internal states to one another as well as transform them. So the alternative, which was put forth by the chief rabbi of England, was to try and hedge bets and say, look, we don't know for sure that we are actually in the moment of redemption right now. So why don't we make it an aspirational statement rather than a definitional statement? I personally prefer the original, not just because it was beautifully written and composed and a wonderful moment of unification for not only the religious members of the Jewish world, but also the secular, Shai Agnon being one of the contributing editors to the final form, but because if you don't state it, you won't actually believe it. We've been saying for 2,000 years, we want redemption. We've been saying for 2,000 years, let this be the year that maybe we will find redemption. Next year in Jerusalem, right? L'shana haba'a b'Yerushalayim, we say at our Seders and at many other times. We've been aspiring to redemption for a couple thousand years. The Zionists come along in the 1800s, and they actually made Israel happen. Yes, they had aspirations, obviously, but they also had action. And that action transformed what we had wished for 2,000 years into something that became real. In fact, there is a very famous quote by Theodor Herzl: "If you wish it, it is no dream." Right? Ein zo agada. Right? Im tirtzu ein zo agada. If you were willing to put your will behind it, then it is no longer just an agada, a legend, a dream, a fairy tale. It can become real. And Herzl was proven right. That the time was right, the people were right, the action was right. And thus, we act as though this is indeed the blossoming. Now, I will admit that none of us alive today are Nevi'im. We are not prophets in the classical biblical sense of the word. There is no Isaiah, Ezekiel, or Jeremiah alive among us today, and anyone who claims to be alive and being a prophet today is definitely a scammer, and be aware and run away. But just because we don't have a Navi doesn't mean we can't act like this is redemption. What is the worst that can happen? That redemption takes another 10 years, 50, 100, 1,000? Okay. We've waited 2,000 before. Is it better to wait for the beginning for the full flourishing of redemption with the first blossoming in place in the land of Israel? Or should we say, well, Mashiach's not here yet, so let's just give up on the enterprise. You know, maybe it'll turn out okay, maybe not, but let's not act like it's all that special. No. We don't need a prophet to tell us that the modern incarnation of the state of Israel is special. Every incarnation of Israel has been special. You need only review your Tanakh to go back to the original versions, the state of Israel under Abraham, the state of Israel under Joshua, the state of Israel under David. All of that was an incredible part of the glory of our people and the contribution to the entire world. And then the Babylonians destroyed that independent state, and we came back a few years later under the Persian rule, and we had our mostly independent-ish state, certainly religiously and culturally, under them for another few hundred years, all the way up until the Roman destruction that came in 70 CE. Both of those pillars have been an incredible statement of what it is to be Jewish. And though we may not have had one for 2,000 years, we are still able to see in the blossoming of this new one, indeed, the blossoming of redemption. We don't know exactly which way it'll go, because, as I said, we are not a Navi. But we have learned something powerfully from this incarnation that the prior two only gave us glimpses of. But see, the prior two incarnations were both created primarily by the will of someone mightier than us. God, obviously, but not just that. The first incarnation, we were dragged, as we'll read about more in Bamidbar, kicking and screaming to the land of Israel by Moses. We complained, we kvetched, we were willing to go back and be slaves again in Egypt throughout that ordeal. That's why we ended up spending a 40-year timeout in the middle of the Sinai. But we got there because of Moses, not because of ourselves. Likewise, when we finally return after Babylonian captivity, it is because Cyrus the Great has given permission, and because people like Ezra, Nehemiah, and the others were there to, again, beat us into shape and drive us into rebuilding our land so that it could be a Jewish place again. The modern incarnation of Israel represents something very different. It represents a literal grassroots effort from all of the people of Israel scattered around the world. From those that went there with their own 2 feet and worked in the fields and worked in the stores and built the homes, to those who supported them, whether they were living in Lithuania or whether they were living in Los Angeles. There was no singular person that was making this happen against our will. There was no grand nation that forced us to return to our homes, although we can talk about the British role some other time. It was ultimately the average Jewish person. And as I mentioned earlier, most Jewish institutions were not entirely in favor of it either. But the regular, common people were. And I am not a prophet, but I know that when we finally reach the state of true messianic redemption, it will be because of what we see in the spirit of what built Israel to be its own place, that it will come from us. Yes, there will be great sages and teachers and obviously Mashiach, etc. But ultimately it will be because we have created the world that represents a world that is worthy and capable of being redeemed. That is what early Zionism put into the mix of Jewish history. That is why I believe, indeed, they broke ground on that Rishit Smichat Geulatenu, that first blossoming. They were the ones who opened up the earth to allow that blossom to poke forth. We don't know how much longer it will take to grow to be a verdant and fruitful tree, but it was because of the average common people, just like all of us in this room, that at least we have made it to this step. Had we waited for institutions, had we waited for governments, had we waited for empires, we would still be waiting. And God only knows where we would be. But of course, that also means that at this point, despite Israel having a government, despite there being many nations on earth that are in support of the continued existence of Israel as a state, we have to remember that we are the ones that first broke that ground. That it is the average one of us that is ultimately responsible for the continued promise of Israel as a place of redemption. And that means that we can't leave it to institutions and governments and others. We have to be personally connected to the continued thriving of the land, whether it be in our actions during wartime like now, or whether it be our actions during times of relative calm. Would that it would be peace. When we support the people that live there, support the growing of the institutions, and that will teach more of the individuals how to reach for that next level of redemption. So I am not a big fan of the brackets. I am not waiting to hope that this may turn to be a better place. We waited for 2,000 years. We have Israel. The potential is already flowering. It is up to us to keep it growing. Shabbat Shalom.